Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on pay equity and fair pay. On behalf of PeopleTech partners, I'm really happy to welcome all of you to this panel with really amazing panelists. We have Kara from Udemy. She's the SVP of People, Places, and Learning at Udemy. We have Maria, CEO at Syndio.
Hi.
And Susan, who's Chief People Officer and Operating Partner of Renegade Partners. Our conversation today is about fair pay. And there are various components that we're going to touch on today, but we have no easy answers. So I just want to share with you, this is a real dialogue for all of us. We had a little prep session in advance of this, and we were talking through all the different permutations and questions and challenges that we face. And so we invite you to be part of this dialogue. So thank you all very much for joining. And why don't we go ahead and jump right in. I'm Natasha Kahimkar, by the way. I should introduce myself. I'm the head of DEI at Fandom, along with People Management, and I'm also the CEO and founder of Melita Advisors. So, Maria, this first question is going to you. I'd love for you to share with us the overall landscape of pay equity. So what is it? What are the components that make up pay equity, and why does it matter today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Natasha. And I'll go ahead. I do have just a couple of visuals for this section that I think will be helpful. Can you, as the presenter, see my screen? Yes? Okay, great. So I think the first question to answer is, what is the cost of a perceived pay issue? Because this is really important and kind of on the forefront of everyone's minds today. And the reason I use the word perceived is really important because this isn't just a pay issue where you're found guilty. Let's say if you have a litigation, the who's who of the Fortune 500 are embroiled in this type of litigation today as we speak. These are headlines from the past 2 months. And so what you need to understand is that if your company has an issue, you're going to spend millions in litigation defense costs just to get to an actual settlement where you possibly could win. And what this means is that if you're not on top of this, able to stand in front of your employees and say, this is something that we're looking at, that we care about, that we're analyzing, and we're getting ahead of, figuring out whether we are compliant or whether we're not, you have a massive brand potential risk in front of you. That's not just litigation costs, but it's also brand and recruiting costs. So that's what we're hearing from a lot of companies today. So how do you do this? So let's just give like a quick landscape of what does it take to actually do this. So step one, you can't just kind of stick your finger in the air and say, do we have pay equity? Are we good, cents on the dollar wise or not? You actually have to do analysis. And this is what's quite daunting for many companies because the old way is going to an outside law firm. You've got to spend months and months on a very heavy, expensive analysis. And by the time you get the data back, it's outdated. There are technologies. Part of what we do at Syndio is we provide a technology platform to do this in a more easier and quick, efficient way. But you've got to do the analysis. You have to dig in. You have to ask the right questions. And quite frankly, for the employees out there who are curious, if you go to your HR team and you say, you know, are we doing this? For the HR teams on the line, you've got to have an answer for your employees. You've got to be able to tell them what you're doing about this. Are you analyzing it? So the first thing is you've got to do analysis. Whether you do it manually with a consulting firm, with a lawyer, with technology, you have to be analyzing it. Number two, we tell our customers all the time that nearly all companies will have gaps because the reason that a pay gap appears is it's from discretion. So discretion across large populations typically favors the majority. The majority in many companies are still men. So this shouldn't be a fearful experience for companies. You should feel relief that I know I'm going to go into this and I'm going to find problems, but guess what? That means I get to fix them. I get to fix them. I get to stay on top of them, and I get to stand in front again of my team and say, hey, we're not perfect. We have discretion in our decision-making like everyone, but guess what we're doing? We're doing analysis, we're figuring out the problems, and we're solving them. This should be a relief to companies. What you don't want to do is think about, how do I hide these problems? How do I mask them? How do I divide or disaggregate my teams into such small groups that I can hide the issues, because that will just exacerbate the problem over time. The other problem is when companies think about, well, how do I just protect and defend? Let me do this under privilege. Let me do it under secret cloak and dagger so I don't have to actually share with my team what's happening. Here's the real deal, and we all on this call know this and have experienced it. Employees know what's going on. They know at a gut level whether the company is paying fairly or not, because people talk, and people are talking a lot more these days in terms of salary sharing parties, crowdsourcing their salaries. People are starting to find out. So move toward transparency. And then step 3, and then I'll pass it back for the conversation just after this sort of high level overview, is it's not an either or. So a lot of times when we're out talking about pay equity, there's still a misconception about market pay versus internal equity. So for years, companies have been spending a lot of money to understand how to pay at market. What is market pay? What is the market pay for particular roles in a company? And what we believe is that companies should also be ensuring they're at pay parity. So that's a difference. It's market pay. Oh, don't worry, employees, I'm Microsoft. You're getting paid very similarly to your peers at Facebook, to your peers at Google, to your peers down in the Valley. But what we're finding, and what a recent pay scale study showed, is that employees care 5.5 times more about pay relative to peers in their company than they do about market pay. So that should be a really nice wake-up call for us as leaders to say, wow, we really should be investing in this as well, because this is what people care about. So it's not an either or, it's pay equity and market pay.
Right.
So with that, Natasha, hopefully that was the overview you were looking for, and I'll hand it back to you for discussion.
Thank you so much for grounding us in this topic. It is so important for us to be speaking the same language here. And, you know, it gets us to talking a little bit about legislation. SB 973 in California, which is expected to be signed into law by Governor Newsom, puts new responsibilities on employers now to report compensation data by gender, race, and ethnicity starting in March of 2021. How effective do you think this law is going to be to ensure equal pay, which is the stated intent of the law?
Who wants to go first?
Take that.
I'll just go right ahead and let Maria answer it.
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in. So SB 93 is pretty interesting. And Susan, I know you have a bunch of really good thoughts on this as well. How effective? I think that's TBD. We know the intent, which is great. We know employers are already thinking about it and considering how to review what they'll send in terms of complying with the law before it's sent. I think the big question is, what's California going to do with the data? How aggressive will they be in looking for disparities and pursuing action? How will they slice and analyze it? And the more aggressive they are, I think the more employers in California will take proactive steps. And really, the best companies already are. And this is an example of the onus shifting from the plaintiff, so the employee, to the onus shifting to the employer. And I think that's a really, really important shift, that we move to accountability and transparency on the part of the companies. And Susan, I would love to hear your thoughts, because in the pre-call you had some really interesting thoughts around this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so interesting about the new California laws is we tend to think collectively as HR practitioners or people who are in the people space about California being on the forefront of legislation. And there's in fact a Colorado law that we were talking about just before.
I was just going to say, that's what, we have an office in Denver, and our team is mobilizing to get there. So we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, and maybe you can follow on with sort of how that's actually shaping the work that you're doing. I'm based in Boulder, but I work at a San Francisco venture capital fund. We invest agnostically. We currently have no portfolio companies in Colorado, but for me to be for me to be compliant as an employer, because I'm an employee of my fund, I started looking into this with our PEO, because I'm a Colorado-based employee, and also, just in the flow of, Colorado people ops people. So anyway, my point is Colorado actually seems to be, I would almost argue, out in front. Some of the components that are quite comprehensive from this law are, one, it applies to employers who have only 5 or more employees. not 100 or more. Which is the California legislation, as I've understood it. So it applies to small businesses, you know, all different, you know, myriad number of businesses. The other one is it has really strong transparency rules around posting new jobs. If you're going to post a new job, you need to post it very prominently internally and externally. And my read of it is you need to include a comprehensive view of what the total rewards are associated with that, compensation and benefits is my read. Kara, very interested if that seems to include equity as well, and equity ranges in the company, because that can get very interesting if you're publishing, you know, number of bips or number of shares, like there can be some non-public information that gets out there in the world. Those are the big things that seemed really comprehensive to me. There's some other elements around seeming to nudge employers, to do thorough pay equity analyses in exchange for a 2-year safe harbor, which to me is sort of, I don't know if it's showing your hand as legislators in Colorado, but starting to, which is if you're gonna say it's optional to do pay equity analysis, but you get safe harbor, to me that's sort of nudging companies along towards maybe a future stricter rule around pay equity. So those are some of the things that stood out to me when I learned about the Colorado law. But Kara, how is that having an impact?
On my side of the house, because we have a significant presence in Denver and our goal is to really grow there, particularly on the sales side, this is something that is a little surprising to me because, as you mentioned, this is hyper progressive. This is this changes the ball game in terms of how we on the people side of business think about compensation and competitiveness and market. And I found it interesting that Maria pointed out to us that we often spend a lot of our time looking at the external market and making sure that we're at parity with external markets, but this is as much demanding that we have parity internally. And those of us that spend time caring about DEI, of course, this is at the top of our list, but I see a law like this, which is requiring us to publish the range for every role that we that we are hiring for, publish them publicly. And as you said, Susan, talk about total rewards. We're asking the same questions. What does that really mean? Does it include equity compensation? Does it include every benefit? You know, all the different pieces. As written, it seems to ask for that. So we will be exploring that as well. So a couple of things that come to mind for me. One is anyone who's operated in Northern Europe, you know, this has been the practice for a long time. You're publicizing your ranges, you're telling people what the job is valued at. And on one hand, I think there's benefit from an equity standpoint, and transparency in many ways that definitely moves us toward a place where the individuals can have agency in the process. The concern that I have around this, and I'll be interested to see how it plays out, is I'm concerned that some employers that don't compete with some of the large tech companies in terms of core salary and see other elements of the work as valuable in things like mission and things like what someone learns in the job. Want to make sure that we as people leaders are able to give a truly holistic perspective, because I would hate to see I'm an employee, because we know this happens, and you simply sort by compensation and you say I'm not going to even look at jobs that aren't in an XYZ category, because as we all know, when you're building a career, it's about looking at the whole job and what you gain in terms of skills and responsibility that will ultimately be the pay that you get later in your career. And that's really where we're finding people of color and women falling behind, right? And Maria, you can, and Susan, please correct me, but I know that the research that I've read to date, and hopefully this will evolve at some point, was that women were really catching up in the first 10 years, right? And in some ways moving ahead, because we were coming in, we were having huge impact in our environments, our work environments, which we know. And then you get into that middle space, which for many women comes with hard trade-offs around family, around other choices personally, that can put you in a position where later in your career, when those folks that are in majority groups are getting the CEO job, your resume doesn't read like theirs because you had a different life experience. So my concern also is that something like this could push a scenario where people are sorting only for a compensation or total rewards versus the whole view. So it's simply a question mark, but a question I'm asking myself is, how do we tell that story to people, that this is more than just a base salary?
And that actually leads really nicely into the next question, and that's the meat and potatoes of the pay equity analyses. So when we do this, we look at the numbers without any filters, and then we add in what some call control factors. These are the things that we considered facts that drive pay differentials, things like education or work experience or performance. But the lived experience of women and people of color, and I'll especially add Black women, doesn't always align with the facts. And this is actually something that a webinar that I participated in a while back, the speaker mentioned this, that the lived experience does not align with what we may call the facts, that the facts may in fact be skewed by someone else's filter that have since then perpetuated outcomes that serve only some. Right? So how do we navigate that? How do we talk about and really address some of what we call facts when it's actually based on biases or so-called truths that might skew those facts? So kind of a meta question.
No, I love the question. So part of what we do at Syndio is we help employers apply lawful non-discriminatory controls. So exactly what you're referring to, or we call them neutral job-related factors. And because it's software, it predicts the degree to which what an employer says they pay for, so why they pay what they pay, is actually true. And then it compares it with actual. So we do the comparison net of gender, net of race, so as if no one had it. And then we compare it to actual. And it's always very fascinating to see what pops up. And we can also help them measure the degree to which those controls may be biased. And the short list of the usual suspects are performance reviews and level. And I'll explain really quickly why those particular controls typically are biased. If you think about facts, there are certain facts and controls that are not biased. Start date, that's tenure. Start time and role, that's time and role. Date of birth is age, and age is a legit proxy for experience by law. So those facts are facts. But now let's talk about performance. That is not a fact. It's a subjective measure of how someone's doing, and it's a measure of how you feel I am doing, right? So that is a very biased thing. The other one that's biased is level. So it's not a fact. Level is someone's assessment of where you slot in. It's not necessarily based on an objective measure. It may be a matter of negotiation or a blend. So for example, if there's a man and a woman applying for a job and the man negotiates for a higher level or higher title, that now is an explanatory factor as of why he's paid more. So if you're controlling by level, you're masking all the things that should matter, which are, what were those two candidates' experience? What's their skill level? What's their expertise? That's what should matter and should play into a pay equity analysis. But a lot of times what companies are doing is they're controlling for level or for title, and that's masking all sorts of things and is a very, very biased control. So those are some examples of how you have to be very, very careful in conducting a pay equity analysis, that you're using the right controls and that you're using the controls that actually do predict pay.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to build on that is just duration of time in a level and it taking longer for women to be promoted. And so, Kara, kind of to your point, I think you were talking maybe a little bit more about middle career, late middle management, but in addition to that, and I don't know as much about that portion, I was looking a lot at the most recent McKinsey Women in the Workplace study that came out last month. And their headline was the broken first rung, which is that promotion for women, in particular from entry level to immediate next promotion, and that being where they were seeing a huge fall off. So I wanted to kind of add that in to build on what Maria said, because that level is subjective and who gets to move up in that level, there's a subjective decision there. And that's what the data seems to suggest, is that the biggest fall off right now and the biggest lack of progress is that broken first rung of the ladder.
And one of our participants, Itamar, has put into the chat a tool that he really likes about framing career decisions. So make sure to grab that URL and look at it later. One thing that I haven't seen a lot of is conversations about use of competencies for things like performance ratings that then at least reduce, they will not eliminate, but reduce bias in assessment for those companies that feel very strongly about tying pay to performance. And using validated competencies allows there to be more of a framework for assessment than the, oh, how's this going? Or that person was kind of snippy this morning, or that person, didn't really participate in the meeting. Yeah. Recency bias or other biases that might come into play, where competencies allow there to be at least more dialogue on and more rigor applied to assessment. I don't think it's a perfect answer. It's actually something I want to look into a bit more myself, but it's something that I think is worth looking into a bit more. But Susan, you've written a couple of articles on pay. You wrote Pay Black Employees Based on Their Performance, Not Your Bias, which appeared in Fast Company in June of this year. And then more recently in Fortune.com, How to Be a Fair Pay CEO. I'd love to hear a little bit about the core concepts that you're conveying in those articles.
Sure. So first, just since we're among pay equity nerds here, I'll just say the title of the first article is flawed, which people probably noticed because the article literally says to get rid of pay for performance. And a lot of the work that I do says to get rid of pay for performance, but Fast Company liked that title. And so they went with it. But for the pay equity nerds out there, that is something that drives me slightly crazy. But the crux of it is, stop paying Black employees in an unfair fashion. I mean, the data is
interesting that it's framed that way, Susan, when we come to the table and say, oh, it's about paying Black employees fairly, and then the headline is, it's only about paying for performance. There's a psychological translation there that's interesting, right?
Yeah, and it's just frankly, it's somewhat of an inaccurate sort of assessment of what's in the body of the articles. Yeah. So I just thought that was funny. I wouldn't share that except in this group with the pay equity geeks like me. I thought that was kind of a fun fact. Where to start? I mean, one place to start is the data, which is really bad. The Colorado law, in the law, it was cited that Latina women are paid 53 cents on the dollar. For white men, Black women is somewhere around 60, 61, 62 cents. It's pretty bad. Hopefully people on Twitter, social media noticed that there was a Black Women Fair Pay Day that basically represented how long a Black woman would have to work into 2020 to be paid fairly for 2019, or not paid fairly, paid the same amount that a white man made in 2019. And we're now coming up on the equivalent, the same thing for Latina women, which is this Thursday. We're in late October, almost November, because of that sort of roughly 53 cents or whatever is on the dollar. So I wanted to start there because I think some people forget how bad the numbers are. And then there's also this notion that maybe it doesn't apply somehow to professional employees or salaried and highly educated employees, and that's not the case either. There was some 2018 data that looked at Black employees, and it was about 80 cents on the dollar. And actually, that gap has widened. Unfortunately, it was something like 83 cents on the dollar roughly 3 years ago, and now it's 80 cents. So it's going in the wrong direction. That was part of the impetus for sort of thinking about this more deeply. And in the context of my work, I work with pretty small organizations, organizations that are sort of 30 to 100 employees. Often these organizations have a founder who's in charge of HR, or maybe a recruiter, and not much else, and sort of a patchwork of executives. And so, that might be some people on this call's sort of worst nightmare, to have a really under-resourced organization. But for me, it's kind of a dream, because it means that there's a voice directly to the founder, and there's an opportunity to build these processes right. And so to come back to your your question, Natasha, is the impetus for those articles and sort of the underlying theses is exactly what Maria said, which is the source of unfair pay or inconsistent pay. I think you use that word consistent, which I really like, is bias, and excuse me, is manager discretion. And manager discretion is well known to be fraught with bias. And that even though anti-bias training is like having a moment, and I think it's a good thing as part of a comprehensive DE&I strategy, like please nobody take away from this conversation that somehow anti-bias training is a bad thing, but there's a lot of academic research that suggests that it doesn't actually eliminate or reduce bias. So that's really problematic. So you give managers a lot of discretion or control over individual pay outcomes. You know that they're fraught with bias and that you can't remove that bias. So the theses of those articles is how do you create processes that reduce that bias as much as possible? So one example of that I work on, with early stage companies is introducing comp bans much earlier in the process. I think a lot of companies used to go to 100 people and then they'd be like, oh, we need comp bans. That's not what we're doing. I mean, I've worked with seed companies that are sub 20 employees and we're putting in place comp bans. They're really simple. But they're trying to sort of create guidelines that reduce or eliminate that manager discretion, which, as we all know, is fraught with bias. So that's one example. Other examples are that are sort of within that thesis are, annual comp outcomes. So who gets to define merit? Like the people in the room talking about performance, and those are again sort of fraught with bias. So how do you sort of extract all the different sources of bias? And one way to do that is not to train against bias, but is to actually remove the discretion. So those are some thoughts. I could go longer. And then, the context of the second piece was really interesting. The Pinterest lawsuit and the Carta high profile lawsuits happened sort of within the same week. Kara Swisher covered them in the New York Times. They made national cycles very quickly about two sort of C-level women who had sort of a list of allegations, but among them were pay equity issues. In the circles that I'm in, which are sort of more early stage circles and venture circles, there's sort of this question of what's the definitive guidance for how you can build in systems and processes so that you don't run into these issues. And so the second article that I wrote, which was How to Be a Fair Pay CEO, was basically just meant to codify that. It's if you don't do anything and you do this, maybe you won't get sued. My hope is to have more of an impact than just helping CEOs not get sued. But that was sort of part of the impetus, was this hand wringing among sort of earlier stage folks of but they don't even have an HR person. How can they possibly know what to do? And it's no, actually there's a pretty clear set of things to do.
Nice.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what's interesting too is we're really talking about two issues, right? There's the pay gap, which reflects the average male-female salary, white, non-white, if you're looking at minorities, any comparator that you have in your data. The pay gap reflects distribution and representation. So if you're looking at average male salary versus average female salary, to give a gender example, what that reflects is where are your women situated in the company and where are your men. And I think that goes back to what the McKinsey report that Susan cited, is that women tend to be situated in the mid-levels. The Colorado law and other legislation, the things about posting jobs, making sure that you're developing, making sure you're giving fair opportunities, that addresses pay gap. Pay equity is equal pay for equal work, and that's where we have 44 state laws and a federal law, and that's where this idea of controls and performance reviews come in. Are you paying people fairly who are doing the same job? And I think step one, again, in doing the analysis, back to the analysis, is number one, so many companies say they're pay for performance, but very few actually are. So the first step is to really do an analysis and see, even in the bias flawed data you're collecting around performance, whether it's a metric number or whether it's an assessment or whatnot, is that actually influencing pay? And I think that's sort of this piece that's missing from the conversation about pay for performance, is many companies have performance reviews in place. And when they do the analysis, those numbers aren't even having a direct impact on pay. So that's even worse, right? So now, because now you're saying, we're going to hand out these performance metrics, and then half the time they're not even going to have a direct influence on pay. So you've got to do some analysis, and first of all, figure out, is our probably biased pay for performance system even working as it is. And if it's not having an impact, so if someone gets a 5 over and over again, but they're actually paid less than their white comparator, that's a problem in itself. So I think there's sort of two lenses to look at pay for performance. And the first one is, if we have that in place, is it even a true control that's influencing pay? And you've got to do analysis to know that.
And that's actually one of the questions that just came up in the chat from one of our audience members, Chad, who's asking about our thoughts on companies removing performance reviews and moving to this regular cadence of manager-employee coaching and feedback conversations. And that if a company wants to ensure a pay for performance culture, and knowing that performance reviews and rating systems are flawed, what are companies doing to ensure the right definition of performance is being used? And directly tied, measured and analyzed against employee pay and from a D&I standpoint. And Kara, I'd be interested in your perspective on this, because I've really been digging in on competencies. There is a technical skill set that we would be looking at, of course, but from a competency perspective, when you use competencies, you articulate what is the behavior and action that you're looking for. What does good look like? What does not good look like? What does an overused strength look like? That's what competency models will do for you. And you can then translate those into questions that can be used in everything from performance assessments to even hiring. And so for me, I'm landing on competencies, but I'd be very curious to get your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think competencies and well-articulated competencies, public competencies, and the transparency that comes with that is the closest we have right now on the people side of business to get to a meritocratic pay system, right? And I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but I'm saying it's probably the closest we have. I think that rating systems are wrought with challenges, as we all know. At Udemy, we have spent the past 2 years moving from a very a system that was your more traditional performance conversation. In the same conversation was a compensation conversation, and there was a perception that they can and should be very tied together. And we've moved to dividing those two conversations, having the manager's role be really around coaching and supporting high levels of performance. And we're starting now, and next year we have what I would describe as an appropriate matrixed competency structure for our size. But as we get ready to scale again in the next year, we're going deeper. So we are layering in what we call job profiles. Right now we have competency structures by department, by field. So we'll say engineers, this is a competency structure for an engineer. We're taking that a layer deeper and saying, this is your job profile for your specific role, Natasha, that you're sitting in as an engineer. And this is what we are looking at in terms of measuring your performance against very similar folks in similar positions. And we're combining that with a really strong OKR and goal setting process. So the hope is that individuals will have very clear understanding of what good performance looks like. And then what we do is we have what we call level set conversations. So the idea is we are asking a manager and an employee to come together and get to a place where there is alignment on where this employee is within their level. And then we translate that automatically into a compensation element, right? So we're not asking a manager to come in and tell us, here are the dollars, here are the cents. We're asking them to tell us where someone is within our structure. So we're trying to take as much of that bias around, dollars, cents, the psychology of money away, and be able to instead just apply a measure against a transparent, open matrix around competencies. And then on the flip side of that, we have a self-advocacy course where we ask all employees, and we present it to our full set of employees and ask them to participate in it prior to our twice a year reviews. we call it our level set conversation, so that an employee can come to the table. They can communicate how they assess themselves against our competency matrix, and we can again get as many data points as we can in communicating around levels and this framework, because I do believe that the more data you have, the more information you have, the hope is that can fight some of this inherent bias. We are imperfect. We are not there yet. These are our best efforts to move in that direction. But I do think we in sitting in people leadership seats have, this is the best we can do by providing structures that people can work within, that can get us as close to a level of parity as possible. And I would love to hear more around this, because ultimately my goal is that every employee who comes to Udemy knows that if they perform, if they have impact on our business, there will be good outcomes for them. And I think the other side of this is understanding that my belief is that having pay practices that are fair and consistent help everyone. I think there's an inherent fear, and let's just call it out, for primarily white men who have benefited from this system, to that there's going to be risk for them. But I would also like to say that what I have seen in my career is we have a certain archetype for someone who is successful and makes a lot of money. And I'm simplifying this, but they often have male attributes, and maybe aggressive in negotiations, maybe aggressive in self-advocacy, those types of behaviors. There are still white males that don't benefit, that suffer alongside women of color, other minority groups that may have a bias. And by leveling up the skills for self-advocacy, by creating frameworks that are fair, I believe that everyone wins, and the business wins in the end. And when we know that we have successful businesses, that often translates to success for our employees. So I think you have to look at it holistically in that way too.
Yeah, there is inherent privilege that exists, that what a privilege it is to complain about something like that.
Right, 100%.
So this comes into play, which is where self-advocacy really makes a massive difference, and having the right infrastructure to allow for that matters. One of the ways to combat bias is to put in checks on decision making. I don't want to be looked down upon or criticized that I may have introduced some bias. And so there is a movement as a result to sort of check yourself as you're going through this conversation. And before I continue, I just want to invite our audience to feel free to add questions to the Q&A section or in the chat. We're happy to answer your questions. But one thing I'm interested in, and Maria, I wonder if you have any experience with this. There are a number of companies that have completely moved away from performance reviews. And when I've sat through the annual Radford Tech Comp update, John Radford almost always asks the question, how many of you have gotten rid of performance reviews? And a number of hands go up. How many of you have shadow rating systems that are used for compensation? And shyly, a number of hands go up. And so I'm wondering how that's changed over time. I mean, how is that different from 5 years ago? Has anything changed there? Or are there still these shadow rating systems and shadow structures? And I use the word shadow because it's a little like it's behind the scenes, right? It's dark, like something's going on there that is not transparent, which gets back to what Susan was saying about the importance of transparency. So Maria, what are you seeing if you're allowed to share, just high level from your customers and from people that you're speaking to?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I think what we're seeing specifically, because again, we provide software that enables companies to analyze and resolve these gaps in an ongoing way. And so what we're seeing with our customers specifically, that are everything from the type of companies Susan works with, the up and coming tech companies that are scaling very quickly and very high growth. So the composition of their workforce is constantly changing, all the way up to the Fortune 500. And what we're seeing is that measurement changes the game, because when you have to be held accountable, not only to your employees, but also to the measurement of data, you now have to be accountable to what's really working and what's not, and where discretion is inherent and where it's not. And that's why data and innovation in tech really does change the system, because instead of being able to do all those things I talked about at the beginning, divide and hide, disaggregate to green, exclude comparators, so everyone's their own special snowflake and you can't really say anyone's like for like. That was sort of the old system that you're referring to. Well, this person, it's actually not the same job as this other person because they have this specific thing they do that someone else doesn't. You can't do that when you're looking at data, because you're removing some of that discretion and some of that commentary. So I think what's really key from our customers is they're willing to go in with openness and say, okay, this is why we say what we pay. But let's take a look. Let's take a look and see, number one, if that's true. And then let's figure out how we want to fix those policies that seem to be broken. Doing that with the intent of knowing that they are going to be held accountable from a data perspective is what makes the difference. And I'll say the second piece, which we've talked about a little bit, is what's changed from 5 years ago is companies' willingness to be transparent. So Stitch Fix is a great example. They're a customer of ours that I can say publicly. They went public with their pay equity efforts a month ago, and they did a blog to their employees that was very thoughtful, because what they wanted to do was say, here's why we pay what we pay. And we're not going to show you full grade military salary bands. I think we're quite a long ways from that. There's still some pros and cons around total pay transparency. But what companies are starting to do is say, here are the policies that actually influence pay. Here are the ones that you should know about. Managers, here's how you talk to your employees about how they increase their pay. And here's how we're holding ourselves accountable to make sure those practices are actually working. And I think that's the difference. There's accountability, there's transparency, and there's data collection and analysis to make sure that it's not some hokey special snowflake, I just like you, we play golf together, all those examples that we've all heard and experienced. I mean, I think we've all experienced them. I think that's what's changing in a really exciting and hopeful way.
Susan, I wonder if you can shed some light on that. That was really terrific, Maria, really good perspective. From your perspective, though, Susan, working with much smaller companies in the very early stages, how do you get them off on the right foot?
There's a couple ways. One is sort of what I mentioned earlier, which is putting in place comp bands and a corresponding philosophy earlier, getting to the perspective that we're going to pay at the P50 for cash and the P50 for equity, and we're going to adjust geographically based on these factors, like getting to that sort of statement, having that statement tied to the underlying talent acquisition strategy that they need to achieve their business goals, like the linkage has to follow from your business goals, and then pursuing market-based comp. And it's actually kind of a relief, I think, when I talk to a lot of founders of 30, 40, 50, 60, 100-person companies, because frankly, if they've done a good job at deciding sort of who's still in the boat and who's not in the boat, meaning that they have the ability and willingness to part ways with employees, then the people who are in the boat are kind of all by necessity, hopefully like doing a really good job at building the early stages of the company. And so not doing sort of heavyweight ratings-based performance management cycles, it also saves them time. It saves them, an executive sponsoring like a big effort of here's why we're doing it. That communication cycle out to employees on performance management is really onerous. It can be really valuable if it's done well, but usually, like often it's not done well. It's sort of, and the risk to not doing it well, I think, is higher than the risk to just not doing it and sticking with market-based comp. Because then, to Maria's point, that gives you the ability also to speak fairly openly with your employees about, here's what we pay, here's why we pay it, here's how long that may last. Because usually when I'm working on comp philosophies, they're not 5-year plans. They're a plan to get them through that round of funding to their next round, when their valuation changes, when the underlying composition of cash versus equity typically changes right after a round, because of the way multiples shift, like the equity upside that an employee could expect. And so it's actually quite a relief. CEOs can just say to their employees, like, this is our plan, we're paying at these levels. We've comped it to other startups that are also in the same stage. And we will adjust it likely when we get to our next funding round, which we anticipate is going to be in 24 months. There's some clarity there that really helps. And again, it's that simplicity. Performance cycles, as everyone on this call is very well aware, take an incredible amount of time. And yet, you know, there's this there's this data point that's like gone around cycles, which is something like 9 out of 10 HR professionals believe that the performance cycles that they're doing are somehow biased and flawed. And so it's like they take up so much time and they lead to outcomes that look sort of precise. You know, this person got a 4, they get a 6% raise. This person got a 3, they get a 4.5% raise. There's this precision there, but I think sort of where I've landed is it's somewhat false precision, and it also takes a lot of time. And that's something that the early stage startups, like, they don't have extra cycles on this stuff. And there's simplicity there that also works really well with the lack of discretion too.
Right. Thank you. Thanks so much. Kara, we have a question from our audience, and that is, what tools would we all recommend for companies to understand market compensation and equity for different roles? And since you've worked in a variety of different companies, different ages and stages, I'd love to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, this could be a whole other webinar about how we feel about market data and what are the what are the different reporting tools that you'll use. I'll just mention a few things here. I think option impact, option driver is what a lot of tech companies, especially early stage tech companies, will use. In addition to Mercer, Comptrix, their market data tool, and Radford. Those are tools that I know that a range of people in positions like mine use in different mixes. I think also do not underestimate your own market intelligence as you're in market. And I think it's always important to make sure that you are collecting data from the candidates that you're interviewing and communicating with, so that you know what is true to your particular market in terms of the types of employees you're trying to hire. I think this will all shift significantly when we have publicized ranges like we will in places like Colorado, and I expect soon after other locations. I think in terms of some of the pay equity pieces, Syndio, we are a customer of Syndio. Maria's here. I think they've done a nice job with their platform. And Compass, which is compa.as, is another tool that I've heard great things about and have had the privilege of leveraging in the past as well. But open it up to this group. That's just a short list. The good and bad news is there aren't a ton of great options outside of that. This has been an area of work that I believe hasn't had a ton of innovation outside of people like Maria in the past 5 years. And as Susan said, there's a much higher demand as employees get more sophisticated about pay. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that tenures are reducing, and we have the social contract that we have employees with employees has evolved to where employees themselves have more agency in the process. So when they're going back out to market themselves every few years, they're getting a lot better information about what their value is in the market. So we equally on our side want to be able to keep up with that from the business side and make sure that we're able to deliver for those candidates as well.
I think one note that Kara alluded to, but I'll make it really explicit, is all of that data is lagging. And so, and there are some reports even that only come out. Yeah. So, I mean, you were like hinting at it, but like, that's just one thing to remember, right? Is, these are all submitted from survey submissions from, Kara and her peers who lead different stages of organization. And then by the time they're digested and fed back to us in the form of Radford or Option Impact or Mercer, they're old. And so that's just something to remember with pretty much all of them. I think there's like, from an investor lens, when I like put on different hats, and when I put on my investor hat, one thing I am interested to see is innovation in this space. And like, you have Syndio that is a data aggregator in some ways, right? Or others that have that are privy to sort of proprietary data sets. Like there's interesting ways to use technology to make that more real time, to make it more accessible, to make it more dynamic, and to reflect sort of the acceleration of changes in our talent landscape, right? Like, you know, in sort of the prior 6 months plus the next 12, call it 18 months-ish, give or take, we're experiencing probably like 30 to 50 years of acceleration in geographic distribution of talent. And that's going to change comp. And there's a lot of talk in the circles that I'm in about what do you do there?
Right.
There seems to be a general sort of like best practice shift towards like geographic elements, but that then also creates complexity because then, you know, Maria and her software needs to adjust for geography because a different geography is compensable. Like you can legally change, you know, you can legally pay me differently in one state versus another. And so all these things are so dynamic, and the problem with the current data set, and I completely agree with the ones that Kara mentioned, they're the only ones you mentioned in the US right now, that could change, you know, is that they're like by definition stale and somewhat circular.
So I wonder if we can quickly jump into two questions. The first question I have is, how do we course correct for that new higher salary where one person will negotiate and get what they're asking for or get close to what they're asking for, and the other one may not, as Kara said, self-advocate or may not be successful. And so the starting off point for those two individuals who may be different races, ethnicities, genders, and there are data here to tell a story. What can we do to course correct? And we know that in some states, there's legislation that says you can't ask for someone's prior work history, and yet companies do, and candidates feel pressure to answer, and they want to build rapport with the recruiter. They don't want to upset anybody. And so I think those conversations, unfortunately, I think are still happening. So I'd love to get some perspective, even like one or two ideas on what do we do? What should companies be doing to combat this, this initial jumping off point that causes so many problems down the line?
Natasha, it is such a great question because I think one of the kind of unknown facts is that starting pay is the biggest factor to pay over time. And so what that means is if you start at just a slight percentage behind a similar peer of a different gender or race, it's going to take you years to catch up, even at a massive advantage on annual increase. So if you knock it out of the park and you're crushing that person in terms of your annual increase, it's still going to take you years to catch up from a disparity that happened at your starting pay. So that's something just to know out of the gate. And what I always tell people that I talk to around not only negotiation, but just having this sense of asking the right questions of how do you set starting pay as a company that I'm considering working for? Because I know that this is probably the biggest indicator of my career trajectory in terms of pay. So one of the things we have in our product, which is really important and something I'm super passionate about, is again, a starting pay tool that enables recruiters, hiring managers, comp professionals to look at internal equity side by side with market pay. So again, looking at market pay, everyone just had a very robust discussion about how some of those numbers are out of date, how they're survey based. A lot of times some of the tools crowdsource those numbers, but looking at internal equity is a real measure of what are the engineers in my company paid, and how do I make sure that at the appropriate controls, so looking at you as a new candidate, your skills, experience, tenure, whatever the factors may be that we've identified, this is why we pay what we pay, and being able to see a range within which you can set an offer and not pull on the band of internal equity too much. And so that's really what we talk about. There's got to be that intersection between market pay for setting a range and internal equity. So you've got that sort of golden area in the middle that enables a company to set the correct starting pay. And this isn't just for new recruits. And I think that's the other piece to focus on. This is for lateral movements. This is for promotions. This is for internal starting pay offers when someone's changing jobs. All of that has a massive impact on the employee. And from an anecdotal perspective, I think a really interesting question to ask is, if you're in an interview process, for example, is to, number one, ask if the company is doing pay equity analysis, but number two, say, what was the person prior to me paid? Or what is the value of this role? Or what are the peers of this person making? Don't be afraid to ask those questions, because certainly employers have been asking them for decades and only are now not able to. So I think specifically women are a little bit afraid to say, the outgoing person, what was their salary? That is the role you're going into. So don't be afraid to ask those questions.
Maria, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that last one. And Kara and I go way back, so Kara, I'll use you as my example. But if Kara asked that question versus me asking that question, there is a different lens.
Oh, for
How
sure.
safe is it for me to ask that question specifically, or someone who's Black or Latinx?
Yeah,
It is a real issue that we as candidates and as hiring managers, really, we deal with this. And is it aggressive because I asked that question? And is it normal course of business because Kara asks that question? And she's much sweeter than I am anyway, so it's but there is
no,
I think
that
there's a bias inherent here that, I'm not sure how to get over that.
There's still a bias, and there's a bias around all of it, right? I mean, there's a bias still today as a CEO at a Series A company walking into a group of VCs, Susan, to try and raise money between, something that I really experienced firsthand was men are typically judged on their future vision, whereas women are judged on past performance. So the questions of like, we need to see more traction, or we need to, we need to see this or that. And then I'll have a colleague go in and just talk about this amazing vision. And it's this different experience. And so I can completely understand and reflect on what you're saying. But I really feel like until we mobilize women of color to start asking these questions in a unified way and make it something that's the norm, it's going to be really difficult to overcome those hurdles. And that's a tough answer, right? Because that means that you, Natasha, might not get the job.
And I'll say this too. This is a part of our job as people leaders now. And this is why our job is a strategic role versus, 20, 30 years ago, when we were just transacting, we were just sending out offer letters and being the welcome committee. I feel like it's mission critical that recruiters and HR are tied at the hip. I think the world where these used to be two different functions and there was a recruiter over there transacting and then handing them over to an HR person that internally was responsible for making sure X, Y, and Z happened is over. Recruiters are much more sophisticated now. Our expectation should be that they're much more sophisticated, that they're able to understand. I think that one of their biggest jobs, I talk about this with my recruiters, is to guide a decision-making process and make sure that it is as free of bias, that it is as world-class as we can make it, because recruiting at the end of the day is a highly strategic decision-making process. And the reason I'm optimistic about this is only because I've seen so much change in the last 5 years. I mean, the things we're talking about now would never have been on the table 5 or 6 years ago. And I can say that in earnest because I've had personal experiences around those things. And I know that now the expectation is if in certain roles, that if women aren't asking these questions, if people of color aren't asking these questions, then we need to be the ones putting forth the information. Now, I'm not saying that the world is perfect by any means, but I've seen the progress, and I do feel like we as people leaders are in the seat to accelerate the change. So that's everybody on this call, that's people who are advocating for these laws that make it easier for us to create a level of parity internally. It's systemic change 100%, but we're in the middle of it. And this is where I want to say to my fellow people leaders, let's help each other get better at this, and let's understand that this is the opportunity that we have ahead of us. And it's people like Natasha that are going to remind me how important this is. It's people like me that are going to remind my white male colleagues that are trying to understand and learn and get better. So not to be, you know, all full of sunshines and rainbows, but that is the piece that I do lean back on at the end of the day, because we are now starting to begin to see the tools. Syndio didn't exist, you know, 5-6 years ago when we were trying to think, how do we do this? How do we make this happen? Now I literally push a button and see the areas where we're not doing well and can address it immediately. So we're getting there.
There is one sort of, oh,
yeah.
sorry, Natasha.
No,
I was just
please go
gonna
ahead.
add like a yes and to what Maria and Kara have already said, which is another stakeholder that hasn't been mentioned a lot, but that is the investor stakeholder.
Yes.
You know, on public companies, you have these proxy voting organizations like ISS and Glass Lewis. Their rules are also starting to change and are creating a pull on this. Like, you know, you'll get dinged for not disclosing enough. And it started with, I think, specific guidance on gender about 2 to 3 years ago. And they added, well, one of them, ISS, added race this year. That will only accelerate, I think. So as a result, it's a board level conversation in public companies. It's board, it's comp committee, and you're starting to see that pull into the private sphere as well. I mean, I wear the investor hat, and I'm not sure, to your point, Kara, that like 5 or 10 years ago, there would have been sort of a venture capitalist on a webinar saying like, we think pay equity is really important. Like I fundamentally believe pay equity is a fundamental part of a great employee and employer value prop, which coexists alongside, not in conflict, to great financial returns. And you're seeing that come out of public markets. And now maybe I'm a little bit ahead of the curve, but like you're seeing it in private markets too. It is a board level conversation. And that's another good thing that complements some of the other things that we've already talked about of why to do this work.
So much
Natasha,
of
I'll
this
post the link. We did a whole webinar on this last week, actually, with a panel talking about how to talk about this very topic to your board. So I'll share the link. So if people want to check that out,
that would be great.
Great.
That would be great. Thank you. And thank you also for going into that discomfort with me, that, you know, what we're role modeling here, folks, for those of you joining, is that this is not a comfortable conversation. This is real and raw, and it can be uncomfortable. And it is about stepping into that discomfort. That is what builds momentum. And that's where, you know, Maria's saying, you know, candidate, consider doing this, and having that conversation of how do I do that when I may be perceived differently? How does a woman do that? How does a person of color, how does a Black woman do that when we know that the biases are most strong against Black women? Mm-hmm. How do we do that? And not engaging and shying away from that conversation, I think, is where we end up in an illusion of inclusion, is what I call it. Nobody steal that, please. But that of inclusion is where we end up in trouble down the road. And so where we'll end, and I'm so sorry we went over a bit over time, but last message to share with everybody here: equity is about the infrastructure and the processes. It's the hard stuff that you really have to roll up your sleeves to address. And what Susan and Maria and Kara are talking about is they're rolling up their sleeves and digging in on this. We don't have answers for everything, and there's no perfect solution. But asking the right questions and not being afraid to step into that discomfort, that takes us 3 steps ahead than where we were yesterday. So I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. Thank you, Susan, Maria, and Kara. And thank you, PeopleTech Partners, for hosting this webinar today. My ask to all of you, those of you who are eligible to vote in the US or whatever country you live in, please vote. Voting matters. It's a privilege. Please vote. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.